Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Cheryl Rockman-Greenberg, and I'm honored to moderate this panel. I hope everyone can see the slide which shows the name of this session, Leaving No Child Behind, Best Practices for Promoting Equitable, Ethical, and Community-Oriented Expansion of Newborn Screening in Canada. Just a few housekeeping notes for the participants and the audience. Please turn off your videos and microphones. Please note that this video is being recorded for the participants. And you will have received a link to a short survey that you'll be asked to kindly complete. It'll only take 1 or 2 minutes at the end of the session to provide feedback. These are our panel participants. And I'd like to start, as we do in Manitoba and elsewhere in Canada, with a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that we are gathering on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Cree, Dakota, Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation, and on traditional lands of which we all reside in Canada. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So this morning's panel is on newborn screening. And newborn screening developed in the 1960s. Newborn screening distinguishes apparently healthy newborns who probably have an underlying metabolic or genetic disorder, but who have not yet manifested signs and symptoms, from newborns who do not have a disease. Newborn screening is not diagnostic. Babies with a positive newborn screen must be referred for diagnosis and confirmatory testing. And newborn screening is a provincial responsibility and in Canada, and the federal government plays no overall role with implementation and monitoring of the newborn screening system. And you can see that from the definitions that they're both targeted and population-based screening. And we'll talk today about the evolution of population-based newborn screening for SCIDs. The principles of newborn screening are based on those that have been published many decades ago by Wilson and Jungner. The principles are as follows. The condition that we screen for at birth should be treatable. It should be frequent and it should be severe. It should not be easily clinically identifiable. And as I said, at birth, these babies for whom we just screen for with newborn screening are clinically normal. The screening test should be simple, inexpensive, sensitive, and specific. We must have the follow-up machinery in place for diagnostic confirmatory testing, as well as counseling, and follow-up must be established to complement the actual beginning of the newborn screening program. And based on the principles of Wilson-Jungner, there should be some cost benefit to society. And these are the gold standard principles and practices of screening published back in 1968. Today, we'll talk about newborn screening for SCIDs. But newborn screening began in the 60s across Canada with screening for PKU. Technological advances, example, tandem mass spectrometry and gene testing, made it possible to screen for dozens of disorders at birth, where effective treatments became available if they began pre-symptomatically, and the panels of disorders screened for across Canada and the territories at birth has greatly expanded over the years. Today, we'll talk about newborn screening for SCIDs, severe combined immunodeficiency disorder, to illustrate how provinces can introduce health policy changes that reflect their population demographics. The process began with population-specific research with community partnership that ultimately translated into into universal newborn screening for SCIDs in Manitoba, which formally began only in September 2020. Ontario led the way at newborn screening for SCIDs, beginning with Newborn Screening Ontario's program in August 2013. So today we're going to start with a talk by Launda and Chief Moody. Launda is a nurse practitioner from NCN Cree Nation in northern Manitoba. She's a patient advocate. And Marcel Moody is her dad. He's the chief of NCN First Nation and vice chair of the MPO Chiefs Task Force on Health. So we'll start with them. I'll ask them to now begin. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? Hello?
Yep.
Hi, my name is Launda. I'm a nurse practitioner. I'm from Nelson House Cree Nation. My son has just been recently diagnosed with SCIDS. We are from Nelson House. We have, SCIDS testing was available in our community for families, and that's been taken on by Cancer Care through the HLA labbing. They've been doing that for us because, we've had a few cases of SCIDS. SCIDS seems to be more prevalent in our community. It's affected many families. And personally, like my family is from Nelson House. We were born and raised there. We moved to Winnipeg. So, our people have been there for hundreds of years. Our ancestors have been there for tens of thousands of years. We have embraced modern Western science by combining it with traditional healing. Over the years, we have known of these babies in our community who have died of SCIDS, but we didn't originally know what the cause was. We just, it was more like the babies had died from pneumonia. Nobody really knew what the cause was. And only in the last couple of decades, significant findings have helped early SCIDS detection and care to ensure the safety of these children. Originally, newborn screening was not offered provincially to members that have moved out of their communities, like us, for example. We have moved to Winnipeg, and we missed the screening because, our care wasn't from Nelson House, and my baby wasn't born in Thompson. He was born in Winnipeg, so the screening had been missed on him. So he got really sick, and later we found out that it was SCIDS that was affecting him. And then thanks to Cancer Care, screening that was offered to NCN members, but now it is made provincially possible through all of Manitoba just recently. And working with the doctors and nurses at the Children's Hospital and Cancer Care in Winnipeg, we learned that SCIDS is a genetic disorder that parents pass on to their children. And now, we want to make this universal to all of Canada so that, every baby can be screened and properly cared for, and so that no other child will be affected by this. And, with effective supports, we can now ensure better outcomes, early detection, improved support for the families, and better awareness for everyone. And we hope that, SCIDS is, screened across Canada. Thank you. Cadet?
Good morning. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, unfortunately, I couldn't log on this morning. I've been trying since 9 o'clock, but our technology up in northern Manitoba is not the best. So when you need it, technology is great when you need it, but when you need it, that's when it doesn't work for you. So, Launda, are we flipping through the presentations?
Yeah, I'll flip through yours. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Obviously, I'm the chief of Nisichawayasihk Cree Nation. Obviously, we have a lot of young children in our community, and obviously we want to provide the absolute, best care for our nation's children. And we're trying to create awareness of SCIDS in our community, and so it's been a challenge, and nobody knew anything about SCIDS until recently. At least from the leadership perspective and from a personal perspective. Now we know it's out there, we know it's happening, so it's unfortunate that young children have to go through this because I went through it personally with my grandson, and it was a learning experience. It was also challenging, not only for myself as a grandfather, but as a leader in my community, to witness a child go through the pain of going through the treatment, and I thank the doctors at the Health Science Center, for their leadership and for their commitment and their passion for the work that they do. It's nice to see. Anyway, obviously, Nisichawayasihk Cree Nation is based in Nelson House, Manitoba, about 800 kilometers north of Winnipeg and 80 kilometers west of Thompson. We have a population of about 5,000 people, the majority of whom live in Nelson House and Thompson. And I reference OPCN here as well, Opunapin Cree Nation, and it's north of Nelson House. It used to be part of our community, but we separated in 2005. They became their own independent nation, and most of the OPCN members were once our members. And the reason why we mention OPCN is because they were obviously part of our nation at one point in time. So the two communities have a total population of over 6,000 people, and based on what I know, SCIDS is prevalent in both communities. So of the 6,000 people that live on reserve, our total population, about 40% live off reserve. And the reason why I mention, that stat is because the people that lived off reserve that had children, outside of our community, they weren't necessarily screened for SCIDS. So they fell into the cracks, and I think Dr. will explain that further. But as an example, for my grandson, he was born in Winnipeg. Both parents were living in Winnipeg, so they weren't necessarily screened for SCIDS, so they fell into the crack. And fortunately, my daughter knew what was going on with our grandson, so she was able to advocate for our grandson. So basically, because of her knowledge, I guess, because of her profession, she really saved her grandson, and she really advocated for my grandson. And the majority of our population are children and youth. Their health and wellness are top priority, of course. And seeing as many young families, our community is growing rapidly with a young membership. And our total population is represented by people under 30 years of age. About 63% of our people fall within that demographic. And obviously, we want to improve our nation's healthcare and education of SCIDS. Screening for genetic disorders and new innovation will hopefully improve detection of other conditions as well. Hey, something's loading up in my computer. I see fish and birds. I think it's finally loading up. We're striving to educate our youth to bring awareness to new parents on the importance of disorders that could affect their children's health. We now have health and wellness services and programs like our Wellness Center, Jordan's Principles Program, and Addiction Treatment Center, and we continually work to better our healthcare services in our community. And obviously, we're going to reduce the stigma, of children, that have SCIDS. As chief, I want to ensure that the families who have a child with SCIDS are not discriminated upon or made to feel different because there's a genetic disorder on their family. We're also working, to share information about SCIDS to all members of our community. We strongly support families. We provide, want to provide family members, with carrier testing and genetic counseling if they want, and that's going to be available. And we want to provide follow-up care. As a grandfather of a child with SCIDS, I hope further announcements in SCIDS and innovation in science will improve healthcare for all our communities. Improvement to care support will ensure our precious children have the best early detection and healthcare accessibility. education, resources, treatment will mean our families have mental, physical, and spiritual care for the well-being of their entire family and our community. We will continue to combine the best of Western science with the traditional knowledge of our medicine healers. This is innovations for our future generations. Obviously, in the past, my daughter's son, my grandson may have died, but he is able to live a healthy and full life. Because of the work that was done by the doctors in Winnipeg, I'm sure, if something catastrophic would have happened to my grandson, it wasn't for the compassion and care of the doctors in Winnipeg, and I truly believe, they saved my grandson. It was tough going through that, that whole process. But with guidance and prayer, and compassion by the doctors, I think things worked out for my grandson, and hopefully, he overcomes all odds and becomes, a person who's going to be living for a long, long time, and maybe at some future time in his life he can talk about his experience with kids on a personal level, and because the innovation of our technology and research, I applaud all the work that's done by everybody to help our kids, especially in my community where there's high number of cases of SCIDs in our community and our sister community. So with that, I'd like to thank you for taking time to listen to our presentation. It's been truly an experience that I'll never forget. And each day we pray the Creator that our son is still alive, and hopefully other kids will have that opportunity to be treated, to be diagnosed and treated with SCIDs. So with that, thank you for listening to me, and thank you for my daughter for doing the presentation, and God bless everybody. And maybe I can log on and listen to the rest of the presentation because I think I'm on now.
Okay. Thank you, Launda. Thank you, Chief Moody. Appreciate you launching this panel with your very personal testimonial that resonates tremendously with us. And it leads me to introduce the next two speakers, Dr. Geoff Cuvelier and Dr. Tamar Rubin. Dr. Cuvelier is the director of the Manitoba Bone and Marrow Transplant Program, and he's the clinical lead for the Primary Immunodeficiency Treatment Consortium here in Canada. And Dr. Rubin, Tamar, is the program director of Pediatric Allergy and Clinical Immunology at the University of Manitoba, and she's directly involved in the diagnosis and treatment of children with SCIDs, and she's a scientific advisor for the Immunodeficiency Canada organization. So without further ado, Dr. Rubin and Dr. Cuvelier.
Thanks very much. Hopefully people can hear me. I'm not, oh, there we go, there's my slide. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm just going to today define primary immune deficiency as well as severe immune deficiency and describe the scope of severe immune deficiencies in our province of Manitoba. As well, I'll provide a brief overview of the general diagnosis of management of primary immune deficiency conditions. So, first of all, what is a primary immune deficiency? Primary refers to a genetic cause of immune deficiency, and that's to distinguish it from acquired immune deficiencies, which can occur over the course of an individual's lifetime, either from an infection, for example, HIV or AIDS, or a medication. So primary is something that someone is born with, an inherited issue with their functioning of their immune system. There are many different kinds of immune deficiencies, and they can range in severity from fairly mild and in some cases not even very noticeable to the patient to extremely severe or profound. And we now know of over 400 distinct genetic causes of immune deficiency. This presentation and the kind of screening that we're talking about, though, is going to focus on the most profound type of immune deficiency. And an example of this kind of profound immune deficiency would be SCID. And some of you may have heard about the bubble boy disease, and that is because of the famous patient, David Vetter, who was born with SCID and was placed in a protective bubble for the first few years of his life to protect him from infections that would have caused him to succumb, because he basically was born without any immune system. And so SCIDs, or severe immune deficiencies, today. So how common are severe immune deficiencies in Manitoba and in Canada? Well, as I told you in the previous slide, there are more than 400 unique primary immune deficiencies with a genetic basis, and individually each one is rare. But if you account for the fact that there are many different kinds, the rate of clinically significant primary immune deficiency is about 1 in 2,000 in the general population. So we do see immune deficiencies fairly commonly. But then when we focus in on the more severe forms, it is somewhat more rare. And we do have quite a bit of data about the frequency of severe combined immune deficiency, or classic SCID, from United States studies from newborn screening programs that have now been around for about a decade. So the rate of SCID in these US studies is about 1 in 60,000 live births. However, we have known for quite a number of years that in certain parts of the world, immune deficiencies, even severe immune deficiencies, are actually somewhat more common. And so my colleagues, including Dr. Rockman-Greenberg, Dr. Marla Schrader, Dr. Paul Caeseele, some of whom are speaking today, recognized this, and they actually looked back at patients diagnosed with severe immune deficiency, including those who underwent stem cell transplantation in Manitoba, and identified that the rate of severe immune deficiency in Manitoba is about 4 times that's been reported in these US studies, so about 1 in 15,000 live births. The other thing that we know is from studying some select populations, for example, some northern Cree communities in northern Manitoba, we've identified that the carrier rate of mutations in severe immune deficiency genes are about 1 in 13 people who carry these diseases. And because it's an autosomal recessive condition, that means that we're seeing this disease in about 1 in 700 births in these communities. So extremely high compared to the numbers that I showed you from general newborn screening studies. So how do we diagnose immune deficiency? Well, as you heard, without newborn screening, we can really only and traditionally diagnose severe immune deficiencies after symptoms start. So these are usually because babies are presenting with failure to grow normally, severe and life-threatening reactions to vaccinations, for example, the BCG vaccine, or very severe, unusual, or persistent infections that don't go away. And unfortunately, in some cases, babies will pass away or succumb to these severe illnesses in the first months to year of life. If there is a known family history of an immune deficiency, then we can diagnose babies by targeted testing before they present with symptoms. But as you'll hear throughout this panel today, newborn screening is a very powerful way to identify these babies before they get sick and to allow them to have targeted treatment early on and have the best outcomes. So as you heard, screening is not the same as diagnosis. So once a baby has been identified with a possible immune deficiency through screening, we then need to do blood tests to confirm the diagnosis. And what we're looking for is the presence of the right cells and proteins of the immune system, and also a test of their function. And whenever possible, once we've confirmed from the blood test that a baby has a severe immune deficiency, we try to find the specific genetic diagnosis, because there are many different genetic causes of severe immune deficiencies. In many cases, these are autosomal recessive diseases or X-linked diseases. So an unaffected mom can pass this on to her child, or else each parent is a carrier for disease and they don't manifest with symptoms themselves. But once we can identify what the cause is and the mode of genetic transmission, then we can provide genetic counseling as well as carrier testing to parents and extended family members that might be affected. So finally, in terms of treatment, and Dr. Cuvelier will talk a lot more about the details of treatment for severe immune deficiency, this is going to involve care at a tertiary level center and with multidisciplinary specialist care. And this can involve things ranging from special antibiotic treatments, blood products to provide immune antibody replacement, and in the case of these severe immune deficiencies, stem cell transplantation in most cases. So with that, I will pass it on to my colleague to continue.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rubin. Just going to wait for my slides to load. Perfect. All right, well, good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Geoff Cuvelier. I'm the director of the Pediatric Blood and Marrow Transplant program here at Cancer Care Manitoba and the Winnipeg Children's Hospital. Similar to Dr. Rubin, myself, and people like Dr. Greenberg have had a significant interest in severe combined immune deficiency populations here within Manitoba. And have played a role as well in newborn screening for these serious immune deficiencies. And so I'm going to spend a couple minutes and discuss about the treatment for serious immune deficiencies, including hematopoietic stem cell transplantation. Just simply because there are likely a number of people from different walks of life listening in today, I'm just going to discuss some quick definitions. Hematopoietic stem cell transplant is a complex treatment or therapy that aims to cure underlying blood and immune system disorders by replacing the new form blood system that's normal. A bone marrow transplant, however, is a type of hematopoietic stem cell transplant, but it is not the only type. Key to this is that we're talking about allogeneic transplant, meaning that the transplant comes from somebody else, because we're not using somebody's own stem cells. We have to use somebody else's stem cells in order to result in curing immunological problem. It's important to remember that hematopoietic stem cells can come from three different sources. The traditional one is the bone marrow transplant. You can see the picture there on the left. That's individuals harvesting a bone marrow in an operating room where stem cells exist. We can also get stem cells from an individual's blood, what we call a peripheral blood apheresis, and an individual gets hooked up to a machine that looks similar to that. And we can also get hematopoietic stem cells from umbilical cord blood that are donated to a larger provincial blood bank. A typical timeline for a patient who undergoes a hematopoietic stem cell transplant is often quite long. In the initial phases, usually in about the first 5 to 10 days before stem cells are infused, a patient will undergo a conditioning regimen, which is a combination of usually chemotherapy plus or minus something called serotherapy, which is a severe depletion of the immune system of the recipient, along with total body irradiation. And the purpose of this is to basically to open space in the bone marrow and to immune suppress the individuals so that they will accept a graft. And this is always done usually in the hospital. And then on day 0, we infuse the stem cells, usually through a central line. And then in the next month, the child will spend generally in isolation in the hospital, because that's when all of the major complications are more likely to occur. And we call this the early post-transplant period. That lasts usually about a month. And often this is when a lot of the early infectious complications occur after stem cell transplant, as well as organ toxicity from the preceding chemotherapy. Usually between about 1 and 3 months post-transplant, there's a recovery phase. Often the patient is out of the hospital and back at home on isolation. They have frequent monitoring, usually 1 to 2 times per week through our clinic. And they tend to have less infectious problems, although it is still a very tenuous time where the child has a lot of potential to remain sick. Once we hit about 3 months post-transplant until usually about 1 to 2 years after transplant, that immune system from the donor is literally growing up. And it takes 1 to 2 years after hematopoietic stem cell transplant for the individual's immune reconstitution to be normal and for them ultimately to be cured of their disease. Often if the child at this point is going back to school, they generally are well, although we do worry about other complications, in particular something called chronic graft versus host disease, where that new immune system essentially doesn't like being in the individual's body and results in an alloimmune attack. Our interest in this particular form of severe immune deficiency that we're seeing in individuals of Northern Cree descent really actually goes back to the 1970s and the 1980s, when this physician here by the name of Dr. Marla Schrader began to notice in First Nations infants of Northern Cree descent from two small northern Manitoba communities were presenting to our institution with combinations of failure to thrive, oropharyngeal and diaper dermatitis, severe bacterial sepsis, as well as disseminated Mycobacterium bovis infection after they received their BCG vaccinations. In fact, we had 4 infants that died following the BCG vaccination in the early 1970s and 1980s. And in fact, this was first clued in 1983 by Dr. Schrader that these children had a severe immune deficiency, when in fact the first child was referred to Boston Children's Hospital for a, quote, immune deficiency evaluation. And this was long before we knew what the underlying genetic cause was. We started performing hematopoietic stem cell transplants for this unknown serious immune deficiency in Winnipeg in the early 2000s, even before recognizing what the actual condition was and what the gene was that was responsible for this. And it wasn't until about 7 years ago, using population GWAS-based studies, that we discovered that the mutation was in a gene known as IKBKB. And this, we found this by looking at a number of kids as well as their parents and doing genetic studies to identify where the gene was. And by this point we had already noted that the population had this immune deficiency, and we were already performing stem cell transplants for it, but not at this point recognizing what the disorder was until this paper. Myself and Dr. Rubin have subsequently gone back and looked at the population to try to characterize how they were presenting. And this population of First Nations children with the IKBKB gene mutation are best described as having a pattern of multiple severe early onset viral, bacterial, candidal, and mycobacterial infections. They are all presenting to our hospital very young, at a median age of 2.5 years, with a range usually of 2 weeks to 4 months. All cases are presenting with diarrheal syndromes and failure to thrive. Oropharyngeal and diaper dermatitis caused by Candida is very, very common. And we're seeing invasive candidal infections, including in the blood, the urine, and the cerebral spinal fluid. When we've gone back and looked at children who have unfortunately died of IKBKB and done autopsies and biopsies, in particular those who did receive the BCG vaccination, we can find mycobacterium in multiple organ systems, including lungs, liver, spleen, and so forth. This list is a very exhaustive list, but what it really shows with is the kinds of infections that these children present to us when we do not have a newborn screening program here. And what you can see are a variety of bacteria, intracranial infections, disseminated viral infection, and serious pneumonia syndromes caused by bacteria as well as viruses. These children present to us, at least in the era before we had newborn screening, very, very unwell, often in an intensive care unit. I think it's also important to recognize that in Manitoba, in the southeast corner of the population, or southeast corner of the province, where we have large Mennonite populations, we see other severe combined immune deficiency and combined immune deficiencies that exist, but are of different genetic etiology. In our Mennonite populations, we see ZAP70, another genetic form called CD3 delta, as well as another form called adenosine deaminase deficiency that the Ontario group is going to spend a bit of time discussing. This became important because of how we had to approach newborn screening, not only for the IKBKB gene mutation or First Nations population, but to also try to target the newborn screening for some of these Mennonite populations. This is my last slide, and this was work that we did through the Primary Immune Deficiency Treatment Consortium, showing that the two most important predictors of survival after hematopoietic stem cell transplants for severe combined immune deficiency are, one, the absence of infection, and two, being able to transplant these children at a young age, less than 3.5 months of age at the time of transplant. This only occurs when we are able to find these children before the onset of infection. And this really, I think, emphasizes why newborn screening for immunologists and for stem cell transplant physicians is so important, and ultimately for these patients. We identify and we confirm the diagnosis of these severe life-threatening immune deficiencies soon after birth, before serious infection develops. We admit the children to the hospital to try to prevent further infections from occurring, and here in Manitoba we will initiate hematopoietic stem cell transplant between 1 and 2 months of age. And with that, I'm going to send over, and I'll be finished from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoff and Tamar. It's an excellent overview of your roles in SCIDS and immune deficiency in general. I'd like to ask now Dr. Paul Van Caeseele, who will present his view from a public health point of view. He's medical director of our Cadham Provincial Laboratory, which oversees the newborn screening program in Manitoba. Dr. Van Caeseele.
Thanks very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to see if I can figure this out now. So I hope you can see my, my presentation there. Is it visible?
Yeah, it's good, Paul.
Okay, thanks very much. So thanks very much, everyone. I'm, as Cheryl pointed out, I'm a public health practitioner based at the public health lab called Cadham Provincial Lab here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And this is where the lab portion of the newborn screening program exists in Manitoba. So if you like, while the Manitoba screening program is one enormous partnership of clinicians, laboratorians, and researchers, this is, I guess, as close as we get to its home. I'll walk you a little bit through the history. You've heard a little bit already about what newborn screening is. From a population perspective, we're looking at newborns and trying to improve the health of newborns via early detection of disease, particularly before it's manifesting itself. And that can include many different possible conditions, including genetic disease, metabolic disease, infectious disorders are even possible. We even include hearing screening and heart defect screening as part of the entire collection of newborn screening conditions that we consider. We do distinguish between targeted screening, which is offered to select identifiable groups, and sometimes that is identified by geography, sometimes that's identified by ethnicity, if we can ask people to identify such things on the newborn screening card that Cheryl showed you earlier. And sometimes a last name or a series of family names is enough to trigger targeted screening. Population-wide or universal screening is offered to all members of that particular group, so in this case, all newborns. But newborn screening has other benefits, so it helps families to decide what their reproductive decisions are going to be like in the future and how they'll approach future pregnancies. It also allows the family to plan for how they'll accommodate the child in their early life and later life, and that may have impact on their other children as well. Overall, it improves the health of the community. An ill child not only affects the child and their family, but it affects the extended family and the community itself as well. So it's a significant thing to keep a child healthy. It's also quite distressing when you don't know what's going on with a child or with a person, and you're pursuing multiple medical specialists trying to figure out what's going on. If early screening can end what we call that diagnostic odyssey early on and establish a diagnosis and therefore establish a treatment plan earlier, it saves so much more psychological and personal distress. Once again, screening is not the same thing as diagnosis. It just gives us that entryway into a more targeted investigation. Newborn screening has been going on in Manitoba for over 50 years. It started really in the 1960s when we managed to go province-wide, and we've added a number of different conditions that we look for. The two most basic, well-established conditions are phenylketonuria, or PKU, and congenital hypothyroidism, or disease of the thyroid. But there's many more that we look for, including both targeted conditions for which we pursue a more targeted approach, and conditions for which we can expect to see it in the general population with a bit of a recurring frequency. So it took us a little bit of a while to get SCID screening introduced. Ontario was way ahead of us in that regard. But what we had was a bit of a unique situation in Manitoba. So our newborn screening committee, I'll walk you through a little bit how SCID happened here. SCID screening happened here. Is our newborn screening is guided by a committee. It's very principle-based on those Wilson and Junger criteria that Dr. Rockman-Greenberg discussed earlier, and of course pays attention to recommendations that are made by national and international bodies about what conditions should be screened for. But at the end of the day, we're very science-based. We need to know whether or not this would screening for such conditions would make a difference to the Manitoba population. So we take a very close look at what's going on in Manitoba, and often that requires us to have researchers involved. I've already mentioned how we discuss universal and targeted methods. So I mentioned our committee includes researchers, and it's been a critical part of our program and our ability to inform government about what things we have to keep an eye out for and what things we really need to develop programs for. The other thing that researchers have been fantastic for is not only giving us that heads up, but also in creating the strong ties with the communities that are struggling with their own conditions. The strong pre-existing partnerships that come together as we then start moving into a programmatic approach to screening are absolutely critical to moving forward. And of course, having the researchers on board gives the program some sense of how it's going to need to move forward with screening for a condition and what really the best approaches are. So there's a number of conditions that we can expect to encounter in any jurisdiction in Canada, in any jurisdiction in the world. I've highlighted for you what the Manitoba rates are, but if you look particularly at severe combined immunodeficiency, we'd expect, like most jurisdictions on Earth, to have about 1 in 60,000 births. For Manitoba, that would mean we'd see one every 4 years. Turns out we're seeing one about one or more every year, so our rate is closer to 1 in 16,000, as Dr. Rubin was showing, and that is largely because, and thanks to the work done by Dr. Schrader in looking at decades of children with severe combined immunodeficiency, that we have a couple of populations in Manitoba that are unfortunate to have SCID running in greater prevalence in their population. So the Northern Cree and the Mennonite. When we looked at our 20 years worth of data, we discovered that if we were to use standard newborn screening, we would pick up maybe half of those cases. but the two conditions, the one common in the Cree and in the Northern Cree, and the one common in the Mennonites, would not be picked up by standard SCID screening. This is because newborns, as their immune system is developing, produce a little bit of genetic waste called a T cell receptor excision circle, or TREC for short. And it's very common to find it in high numbers in developing immune systems in newborns. Children who are born without a functioning immune system, those with SCID, will not have any of those TREC circles. That is a marker of essentially an absent immune system. However, the IKB-KB deficiency in the Northern Cree and the ZAP70 deficiency in the Mennonite populations do produce TREC. It looks normal, but their immune system is otherwise not functioning. If we used a standard screen, we would miss those children. So we always have to come up with a solution. So we agreed that we had more SCID than we should, but we needed a solution. So we spent a great deal of time trying to figure out how we could offer SCID screening that would address the fact that we have different forms of severe combined immunodeficiency in Canada, and the standard approach would not work. Once we got that solution in place, and that took a couple of years worth of heavy-duty scientific lab work to figure out how we would do that, then what we have to do is we have to go to government at the end of the day with a business case. We have to say, here's the deal. We've got this many cases. This is how we need to treat them. These are the costs of doing the testing. These are the costs of the treatment. And then we outline all the benefits of doing this. And of course, we're not just talking about financial costs. We're talking about the personal and the psychological costs to families, to communities, and all the benefits that come with saving lives. However, there's also, with any intervention, such as screening, there may be some unwanted effects that you have to deal with. And we obviously couldn't continue with offering live vaccines in the first few months of life. Live vaccines such as BCG and such as rotavirus that could be deadly for a child with SCID, if we only had to wait a matter of days for the result. So we had to make some modifications to how vaccines would be administered to babies, to infants within the first year of life, while we're trying to determine whether or not they might have SCID, even though it would be admittedly rare. So that's our approach. I think Anne will speak to you a little bit more about vaccines and how that can be approached. But all I can say is we're very fortunate to work closely with our researchers who work closely with our communities, and that's what may take time to deliver a strong program, but that's how it's managed to work here in Manitoba. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was an excellent overview of what I think is an excellent newborn screening program for all the reasons that you mentioned. Our last two speakers are from CHEO, from Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. Dr. Pranesh Chakraborty, he's the Executive Director of Newborn Screening Ontario and has been an absolute leader in this field in Canada. And this will be followed by Anne Pham-Huy, who's the physician lead for the CHEO Primary Immunodeficiency Clinic and chair of Immunize Canada. So without further ado, Pranesh and Anne.
Thanks, Cheryl, and thanks everyone proceeding. I get here to talk in the end about a couple aspects of the Ontario experience with newborn screening for severe combined immune deficiencies. So first, I just wanted to go show you our decision process in Ontario for adding conditions to the dry blood spot screening target panel. And it's not a fast process, it's not a slow process, but I think it's a well-considered process to make a decision taking into account all the various complexities that we've heard from previous speakers about in terms of newborn screening to achieve maximum benefit and minimize any harm. In Ontario, we have a process where we start with a nomination. That nomination can come really from anyone, from specialists, from our advisory council itself, the NSOAC, it can come from government, it can come from an individual. In the case of SCID, the nomination came from Immunodeficiency Canada with support from Dr. Chaim Roifman at Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto, and both led this, both advocacy and consideration. Dr. Michael Garrity at CHIA was also very involved with that. We then have a initial review by our advisory council, which is kind of a gut check. Is there a prima facie case here? Is there, are the big picture items relevant to screening in play? And if there is, then a full consideration, which takes several months, occurs. And that is eventually summarized in what we call a Form 3, the third form that needs filling out. And going from that initial nomination in the summer of 2011, we got to a task force finishing their full review in January 20th, 2012. This is then presented, and there's usually a vigorous discussion at the advisory council, and this happened in April of 2012. And at that time, a recommendation was made to the Ministry of Health in Ontario that this should proceed. At Newborn Screening Ontario, we then, as Paul just mentioned, put together an implementation plan and a business case encompassing all of those aspects that he mentioned. And the Ministry of Health in Ontario and the government of Ontario accepted that, and we started screening in August of 2013. I'm just going to flash this up again very briefly, and I've highlighted the one line, and I think that's the theme for our presentation here, is that the test screening should be suitable and acceptable to the population. And our review that I just mentioned is really guided by these still very topical principles that Wilson and Youngner described in 1968, and their treatise is still available on the WHO website. And anyone interested in policy, harms, and benefits of screening, I really encourage you to read that. We summarize our recommendations based on the 4 major aspects outlined in the principle. And for each of those aspects, we note if there are no concerns, or if there are some concerns or uncertainty, and if those concerns or uncertainties are sufficient to recommend against screening. And the 4 dimensions are the condition themselves, the test, the treatment, and very importantly, societal considerations. And that's often where we get the most debate and discussion. This is a quick overview of the timeline of newborn screening implementation in Ontario. And I just want to highlight, we started in the 1960s like most other places in Canada. It was in 2013 that we started screening for severe combined immune deficiencies. And I'm going to put this as a placeholder in my talk. In 2019, we started screening for hearing risk factors, and that included genetic variants that are highly predictive of permanent hearing loss risk. And that becomes, relevant in a second. In terms of our SCID screen, we started with the T-cell receptor excision circle screen. As Paul mentioned, that will pick up many of the kids with severe combined immune deficiency, but would very importantly miss those children with IKBKB related or ZAP70 related SCID. Now, briefly looking at Ontario, this is a map of Ontario. How do we organize our screen positive follow-up? Well, the population of Ontario is very concentrated down here in the southern section, abutting the American border and the Quebec border here. And the stars represent the pediatric academic health sciences centers where treatment and diagnosis is organized. Those treatment centers are responsible for the retrieval of the child, diagnostic testing, and treatment. But what about the rest of the massive province of Ontario? And as I always like to say when I'm talking to Cheryl and Paul, Ontario-Toba, as I call this area, and I think they say it's Manitoba. And we do have this treatment center out here at the outside of our borders, which is Winnipeg. And many of our children from this area do go to Winnipeg for treatment. But the other thing I would note in this map here is that we're really looking at a political map of Ontario and a population map, and especially as it relates to First Nation and Inuit, would look very different. And I still remember when we did our expansion with tandem mass spec screening, the first kid in Ontario we picked up with glutaric aciduria type 1, another disease that is much more prevalent in certain First Nations community, was a kid who lived up in this area and in the OG Cree population. And we are aware that we share a population along this border. So in talking with Paul and Cheryl, and thinking about their plans for SCID screening, and especially IKBKB and ZAP70, we also have an old order Amish and Mennonite population in southwestern Ontario. We're very concerned that a provincial boundary should not define whether or not a child receives that same level of screening for TREC positive SCID, just due to that artificial boundary. So coming back briefly to the permanent hearing loss risk factor screen, that again was a screen where we were looking for genetic variants, highly predictive of a disease, for using a mass array EGENA platform. What we realized is we had an opportunity there to consider any other gene variants that we might need or want to include. And these are the principles we used in that consideration: that it had to be causative of a targeted disease, such as SCID. There had to be a likelihood of it not being ascertained by a metabolite screen. In other words, difficult to predict the likelihood of disease based on the metabolite result. And TREC really fits this for IKBKB and ZAP70. It would not predict that these children are at risk of that disease. And the mutation represents a large proportion of the pathogenic alleles, with a high prevalence either in the general or in a subpopulation. And again, with both the Northern Cree and the Mennonite populations, this would be very much the case. So when we went live with the hearing loss risk factor screen in 2019, we were able to go live as well with an IKBKB screen and a ZAP70 screen, almost in line with the timing of the Manitoba screening starting. We further leveraged that technology for SMA screening just a couple of months ago. And the last thing I'll mention, and this is really the segue to Anne, Dr. Pham-Huy's talk, is that in 2014, so backtracking a little bit here in the timing, the government of Nunavut signed a new laboratory services contract with Gamma Dynacare. And at that time, before that time, newborn screening samples were going to Quebec for Nunavut, and really the Baffin region of Nunavut. In 2014, that switched to the samples coming to NSO in Ottawa. And that meant that the babies in Nunavut were now receiving the Newborn Screening Ontario panel of targeted diseases and not the Quebec panel. And as Anne will show, that had and has had several important implications that have taken some time to work through. So Anne, I'm going to hand over to you. I think you can advance the slides yourself, right?
Thank you, Pranesh. I'm actually going to ask Pranesh if you can advance the slides. I'm not sure if I can do it. Can you hear me? Can you put the slides? Actually, I don't have the slides.
If you're in full screen view, just go to out of the full screen view.
Maybe I'll just, okay. I'll just ask you to advance. I have the last slide on. But anyways, thank you so much for the opportunity to share my part of the story. So as Pranesh was saying, I think in talking about the newborn screening experience in Ontario, I'd like to go through a little bit to share with you how our journey took us inadvertently to Canada's Great North, and more specifically the Qikiqtaaluk region of Nunavut. So here's a map. We showed different maps of Canada. So now you see the map of Nunavut, which is divided somewhat into three main regions, which comprises over 25 communities across Nunavut. And so in green, I'll focus on the green area, which is the Qikiqtaaluk region. Health is distributed, or there are health pathways, I guess, to certain southern centers. And so the Qikiqtaaluk region, which used to be called the Baffin region, if anyone needed further medical care, would be transferred to Ottawa. And if anyone has had the opportunity or the privilege to travel from Iqaluit to Ottawa, it's about a 4.5-hour flight. It's about over 2,000 kilometers in distance. And you can imagine in the most northern communities, it's over 3,000 kilometers. So it's not, it's a good trip. So going through this story of how, I won't say all of a sudden, but at some point between 2014 and 2015, the newborn screening for babies born in the Qikiqtaaluk region underwent the screening for Ontario. As you may know, Nunavut has one of the highest birth rates in the country. Most infants that are, most pregnant women in the Qikiqtaaluk region will give birth in Iqaluit, and there's about 400 or so births per year at the Qikiqtaaluk General Hospital. So, as it was mentioned, since we've done newborn screening for SCID in this population around 2014-2015, we've had 3 infants that were screened positive. None of the positive screen were false, and all of these infants were subsequently diagnosed with ADA deficiency, which is another form of severe combined immune deficiency. All of these infants were transferred to Ottawa at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario for evaluation, diagnosis, and as well as management. And unfortunately, all of these infants did receive a BCG vaccine at birth. Next slide. Oh, this is, yeah, okay. Maybe click one more, because I think somehow there's a... So I'll just backtrack a little bit and talk about 2 high incidence situations that we were dealing with. So I think we alluded a little bit about vaccine, so specifically about BCG vaccine. So for those who know, BCG is a live attenuated vaccine derived from Mycobacterium bovis, which has a protective efficacy of anywhere between 50 to 100% for the prevention of tuberculosis or TB meningitis and or disseminated TB disease. And BCG vaccine is recommended by the World Health Organization for all infants that are living in endemic areas with high prevalence of TB. And in Canada, this means that routine BCG immunization is provided to infants in some First Nations and Inuit communities living in the Northwest Territories, Northern Manitoba, Northern Quebec, and Nunavut. In Canada, the BCG vaccine is actually not licensed, so it does require special access since 2012. But the story with BCG vaccine, which has been alluded in the previous speakers, is in the 70s, 80s, and more so in the 90s, public health authorities identified many cases of disseminated BCG disease in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children that subsequently were found to have unrecognized underlying primary immune deficiency. And catastrophically, some of these children did die. Others had severe consequences of having received the BCG vaccine in the context of a compromised immune state. And so following this, the Canadian Pediatric Society did a surveillance study where they surveyed pediatricians across Canada from 2004 to 2010 to identify cases of SCID and in which population they were occurring. And so they identified about 40 cases of severe combined immune deficiency in the Canadian population. And they noted a very skewed distribution of SCID within Canada, with at least 3 times higher incidence in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children versus non-First Nations, Métis, Inuit Canadian children. So these studies and these observations suggest that there's a higher incidence of SCID. As we just heard, Manitoba, with their studies, report an incidence of around 1 in 16,000. And if you can do quick math from what I presented to you, with a birth rate of about 400 per year not in all of Nunavut, just specifically in the Qikiqtaaluk region, and with having had 3 infants diagnosed in the last couple of years, this brings up an incidence very high of anywhere from 1 in 500, 1 in 600. So now, if we add this other serious condition, infectious disease, into the mix, so tuberculosis. So again, sadly, as we all know, the incidence of tuberculosis in Nunavut is highly unacceptable, with rates of quoted at more than 66 times higher than the rate in the general Canadian population. So now we have a population that we think, well, we know, or we've documented at least, high incidence of SCID, but also high incidence of tuberculosis. And again, just wanted to mention that there are initiatives, especially with ITK, to try to eliminate TB from Nunavut, or from the whole Inuit Nunangat, by the year 2030. So now we have, again, opportunities where maybe there's a way to prevent, if we are able to identify these children with a severe combined immune deficiency prior to giving the live vaccine, which we know has very terrible consequences if given in an immunocompromised child. And so this is, I guess, another good outcome of being able to diagnose a condition prior to disease, but also certain health policies might be impacted. So next slide. So in Nunavut, the BCG vaccine used to be provided at birth, but now with our new information and knowledge about incidence of SCID in this population, the Nunavut Ministry of Health has changed their health policies or immunization program to delay the BCG vaccine to 1 month of age. And therefore, you can imagine that newborn screen is done at birth. We typically will receive the results of the newborn screen for SCID within 10 to 14 days, and therefore we will know which infants are affected or presumably non-affected. And therefore, if they are affected, then obviously the process of trying to confirm the diagnosis and provide treatment will ensue, and then we would not give the BCG vaccine to those infants. And if the screen is negative, then therefore they can receive their BCG vaccine at 1 month of age, and then follow on with the rest of the immunization schedule. Next slide. So in fact, when I first did these slides a few weeks ago, we had 3 infants. So I'm just going to give you a quick update in real time. We unfortunately had another infant that screened positive and subsequently was identified and diagnosed with AD deficiency. But because this infant was born in October 2020, that infant did not receive the BCG at birth, which is a good outcome for that child, because if they do require a very long antimicrobacterial treatment as well. Next slide. So we talked a lot about the science and the medical odyssey. I just wanted to close, I guess, the conversation with a few slides, maybe showcasing that sometimes the medicine or the science is actually, I wouldn't say the easy part, but only one part of a a journey or part of the issues that we need to address. And so, you know, I hope I showed you how far, just from a distance perspective, it is for children to be transferred to a healthcare center such as CHIO in the south. And so it is associated with a lot of other factors that impact the general well-being and health of the patient, but also their family and their community. So being diagnosed with severe combined immune deficiency is not a quick fix, as you saw with Dr. Cuvelier. It requires actually sometimes years, especially if you're going to undergo a curative treatment such as hematopoietic stem cell transplant. And so, you know, these are things that need to be considered and discussed along with true partners from the communities from the onset. So I guess my little plug at the end would be, you know, if we're talking about health policies or science policies, that obviously we are aiming to improve health, but again, to keep in mind that it should be done with respect and inclusiveness and responsibility. Like I said, the medical and the science might be the easy part, but creating that infrastructure that will optimize all levels of care for the patient is really needed at each step. You know, once you've screened, you've diagnosed, your management, and the long-term management, the follow-up as well, especially if you're dealing with treatment that is specialized and is far from home. So again, just to advocate that the patient really includes the families, the community, and they really should be partners in how these policies should be created. And always very impressive to hear all these technologies, but again, technologies should address the interconnectivity of all aspects of one's being and care. So with that, I will conclude my part.
Thank you very much, Anne and Pranesh. This concludes the formal part of the panel. I think we've heard some excellent talks that is really giving, I hope, the listeners a good overview of not just how newborn screening for SCIDs was introduced in Manitoba, but its implications for the whole country and the whole principles of newborn screening in general. I wonder if anybody has actually submitted any questions into under the Q&A. From what I understand, you have to go to menu and then click on the button that says moderate questions, and I think you could ask your questions in that format. I do see a few questions that I will read out, and I'll start with Launda. I think, I'm not sure it is clear to everyone who is listening, given that you're from the Northern Cree communities where we had targeted screening initially, why was your son not screened for this disorder? Are you able to unmute yourself and answer that?
Yeah. He wasn't screened because he was born in Winnipeg, and we weren't in our home community. So because we moved to Winnipeg, he was missed.
Yeah, because initially the screening program were from children from the two high-risk communities living in the high-risk communities, most of whom were born in Thompson, and the healthcare providers and the nursing staff in the two communities themselves were very much aware of the targeted newborn screening program. But at that time, there was no way of tracking which families actually had left the northern communities and were living in Winnipeg. And that's one of the issues that, so you could see one of the drawbacks in trying to introduce targeted screening programs, because people do move. And that was most unfortunate, Launda, and we certainly eventually, with Dr. Van Caeseele and many others, pushed towards universal newborn screening in Manitoba for SCIDs, and which of course fortunately became a reality, this past year. Did you want to add anything to that, Geoff or Tamar?
Yeah, I just, we did have a program that we kind of ran locally for the 2 affected communities, and it just illustrates why this is so important to have universal. Had Launda, had your baby been born today, they would have had the newborn screening. That's now provincial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'll just quickly mention that we recognized very early that geographic-based screening, based on being residing in a particular community, definitely had its risks and had the risk of missing a baby. So we knew we were going to have to go to universal screening, test every baby.
Sure, I'll just make one point on that as well. The reason I brought up our permanent hearing loss screening was the addition of an additional variant was actually extremely cheap at that point. But if that platform wasn't there, that barrier to starting is often the biggest issue. And cost effectiveness is obviously a huge deal. But recognizing that population migration is occurring and being able to do that on the existing platform often can help or can even drive policy.
Yeah, keeping in mind too, in my presentation earlier, I did mention that 40% of our people live off reserve. So, it's really important that the universal screening is implemented, right?
Yeah, yes. Yeah. We certainly made that case repeatedly over and over again. But Paul, do you want to make a comment about, in our newborn screening program, the issue of consent? When we did the targeted screening in the 2 northern communities, mostly the babies born in Thompson, there was consent provided by the mom before the targeted screening would occur. But you want to just comment about universal newborn screening and consent in general, Paul?
Sure. Well, the concept of offering a test to anybody, to any parent or to any child, is that you're supposed to know about it beforehand. You're supposed to know that that this is what the conditions are that a person that the practitioner is hoping to look for, and that you're going to be prepared ultimately for those results. The vast majority of children will have normal results, and it really is just a reassurance. But for some families, obviously, this will be a far more intense process, and having their consent to proceed with it is a very important part of it. It's considered standard of care to offer newborn screening, but it's also considered standard of care to always describe the investigation you're about to do and why you're going to do it.
So at this moment, when babies undergo newborn screening, their parents do not have to sign a consent form, but they do have the option of declining newborn screening. It's done extremely rarely, as Dr. Van Caeseele said, because most people really do certainly understand, the indications and the benefits of newborn screening. Some parents, of course, are concerned that it's an invasive test in the sense that you have to draw a little blood sample, but the vast majority of families, 99.99% of families, do accept and welcome newborn screening. There is another question. I think now that we've made the case for newborn screening for SCIDs, certainly in Manitoba and as led by Ontario, how can we make newborn screening for SCID a reality for every baby born in Canada? Pranesh, do you want to talk about the status of newborn screening for SCIDs across Canada? And does every province have its own technology to capture population-specific variants in their province? Gave you an easy question, Pranesh.
Well, I think, Cheryl, as you mentioned, health is a matter of provincial jurisdiction. And so each province has its own process and decision-making system in place. There's often been a desire to try and at least coordinate or leverage each province's work in this area so that it doesn't have to happen 10 different times, and with the territories working with provincial partners usually. So all that being said, the adoption of screening for SCID has not been as quick as I think, I'll say as quick as I'd hoped for, as I think many of us on this panel or in the newborn screening community had hoped for, because certainly there's very good evidence both for the benefits as well as the societal benefits when it comes to cost effectiveness and things like what Dr. Pham-Huy talked about, the BCG policy changes that can go with this, and I think that barrier of individual provincial decision making when our overall population is actually relatively small is one that remains to be answered. There was an effort several years ago that Paul was very involved with, and where the Ontario government had brought it to the FPT table, or the PT health table, and tried to create a process where the provinces and territories at least could work together to do this, but that didn't lead to a sustainable process. Essentially, each province who would want to start testing would need to start their own quantitative PCR platform, so that there is a startup barrier, there's an entropy barrier, or a potential energy barrier there to overcome. But once it is overcome, then certainly that same platform has been used by many jurisdictions to screen for spinal muscular atrophy. And it's an example of synergistic use of technology. I've given the example of the Massarray platform, where it allowed us to do the IKBKB variant testing, but most provinces and most jurisdictions wouldn't have that kind of platform in play. So repeating that, I think it's a success of working across artificial provincial boundaries when it comes to populations being mobile. For the IKBKB and ZAP70 is not one that would be easy to replicate.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Does anybody else want to add anything to that? I don't. No. There's another easy question for you. I think I'll give this to Geoff and Tamar. You mentioned that one of the sources of stem cells are umbilical cords. Do you want to comment about routine storage of umbilical cord blood from newborns? Is that something that should be promoted for the benefit of people who might need to have a stem cell transplant for their child?
Thank you for the question. So there's two things that have to be considered. One of them is private cord blood storage, where a woman has a baby and the cord blood is privately stored at cost to the family, and the other is a public cord system, and they're actually quite different. Private cord blood system, there's almost never an indication to have to do that. We are against private blood for profit for a number of reasons. In this particular situation, if you were to store your child's cord blood, if they were to be affected by SCID, we wouldn't use it because it has the same genetic mutation in it. So private is, for you to do a directed donation to yourself, we just simply do not recommend doing it. That usually costs families in the realm of about $5,000 or $6,000 over the first 18 years or so. There's a difference, though, with public cord system, where umbilical cord blood is provided to the general public. About 6 or 7 years ago, Canadian Blood Services did start a public cord blood system with targeted collection of cord blood that could be used for anybody across Canada, with targeted collections in Toronto, Brampton area, Vancouver, trying to sort of hit some of the mixed ethnicity areas. That does have a role for increasing the stem cell sources across Canada.
But it's not universally accessed by all provinces?
It is. So we can access a cord blood that was maybe collected in Ontario, and we can have it shipped for free to Winnipeg. using the public cord blood system.
So the database of that system is available to practitioners as needed? Okay.
Yes, it is.
Tamar, do you want to comment at all about cord blood storage? And
I think Dr. Cuvelier answered that question. I was going to say the same thing. I think there's a lot of excitement about the idea of diseases that could be cured with one's own stem cells, but these inherited immune deficiency conditions that are of genetic basis are not amongst those conditions that we would be able to cure at this point with the current technology with the patient's own cord blood. So it doesn't make sense to store privately.
The argument I get for private cord blood storage is for future pregnancies, not necessarily, well, if that baby is in fact normal and a future baby is affected, then the family could have access to this cord blood that's stored in a private storage facility.
So almost all the stem cell transplant programs have special directed donations. We will collect cord blood in a situation like that for free and store it for free for the family.
I think that's the point I certainly wanted to make, that, you know, whenever there's an index patient in the family, you know, you don't need to have had previous children's cord blood stored. There's going to be screening of immediate and extended family members anyways. So, okay, that's a important point to remember. Does anybody have any other question that they would want to say? Any comments from you, Launda and Chief Moody? Anything further? Any feedback from the communities and etc. that you'd like to share with us? I think you made the point certainly in your talks that we greatly appreciate. Any last minute thoughts? Launda or Chief Moody?
I think the work is, you know, empowering to our people, to our, to our children. And I just wanted to say that, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this event. I mean, unfortunately, technology up in northern Manitoba was not the best, but I eventually got on, after my presentation. But I just want to say thank you to everybody for your tremendous work.
Well, that's not a problem. One last thing, I think it's hard in this day and age to do a session and talk about things that are very important to us, like newborn screening, without mentioning COVID-19. And I thought somebody might ask, do we know about the effect of COVID-19, either on children who have primary immune deficiencies or who've had successful stem cell transplants? I think that also has to go to Tamar or Geoff.
That's obviously a timely question. There's very small or information based on limited data, because there's so many different genetic types or even undefined genetic types of immune deficiency. There's no blanket statement of how patients with immune deficiency deal with COVID-19. There is actually some data, though, from a combination of patients with particular types of immune deficiency, even patients with acquired immune deficiency like HIV/AIDS, or patients who are on immune suppressing medications, that in a way, surprisingly, some of our immune deficiency patients, including with T-cell problems, don't do as badly as we might expect. In fact, maybe no worse than the general population. And in general, patients, younger patients, infants, children seem to be doing better compared to older adults and some of the other established risk factors. Something interesting is some of our patients who don't have this particular kind of immune deficiency that we've talked about today, but with the most common type, which is a humoral immune deficiency, they actually seem to do better than patients without immune deficiency, again, in some limited observational type studies.
Somehow blunting their immune response is sometimes an advantage. I understand that. Thank you for that. Are there any last minute comments or questions or thoughts? If not, I hope people who've attended this panel discussion have benefited. That certainly I know I have, and it's always wonderful to see the leaders in this field together on a forum, speaking in one place at one time. So I really appreciate people taking the time to present at this conference. This panel would not have been possible without the work and the interest of Dr. Erica Siren, who's behind the scenes there today somewhere, but it was her idea to present this type of forum panel on health policy as related to newborn screening, and to inform the public about newborn screening, using SCIS as an example, at this year's Canadian Science Policy Conference. So we're very grateful to Erica to have put this together and to approach us to participate. So thank you, Erica. And thank you to people behind the scenes who have helped with the technology. And again, thank you very much all for participating. And I think we're going to say goodbye. Thanks again. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.